Good luck.
Thanks. How about you?
That finished, thank God, on yesterday. Yeah.
So accomplished.
Yeah. I'm ready for break to reward myself.
Are you going anywhere?
Yeah, I'm just going to Florida. How about you?
Yeah, Sweden.
Where?
Sweden.
Oh, that's
It was my first time.
yeah. Okay, very nice to meet you.
Era mais feliz ou casual, mas I went through I was in realized dessa vez it's not cold. It's not high. Right, everyone. Here. Right, looks like we're missing some students. Maybe they started spring break earlier, or maybe it's the midterm. But we'll get started. Hopefully, we'll be able to join us. How's everyone doing? Good. Good. How about you? Even better now. Nice. All right. Welcome to Brazil seminar. This session is part of the Political Social Economy in Brazil course offered here at along the CIPA. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session. Débora Diniz is an international leader in the field of reproductive justice and gender equality. Through her research and advocacy, Débora has helped to shape public policy and to improve the lives of countless individuals in Brazil. She's the co-founder of Diniz, Institute of Bioethics, one of the key feminist groups dedicated to bioethics and human rights in Latin America. As an anthropologist, she is a professor of the law faculty at the University of Brasilia and Oswaldo Cruz Foundation in Rio de Janeiro. Her research interests include reproductive and sexual rights, disability, criminal justice and prison systems, and research ethics. As a documentarian, her 8 movies have received more than 50 awards. In 2020, she was honored with the prestigious Dan David Prize. Let me read a quote from their website. In 2016, after testifying before the Brazilian Federal Supreme Court on women's rights to choose abortion, she was forced into hiding and later into exile in the US, where when violent death threats were leveled against her and those close to her. It has been called the first political exile of the new Brazilian colony. We're fortunate to have Débora here with us today, especially on such an important occasion where we will discuss gender and LGBTQI plus policies as part of our International Women's Day celebration. So without further ado, Débora, thanks so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
It's my pleasure, Sydney, and it's really a pleasure to be with you all today. And I'm really a little bit with a kind of anxiety of speaking with not knowing exactly who you are. And I hope that we have a moment after my presentation that I'm planning to use kind of half an hour, if it's okay. But you can jump any moment to raise questions or clarifications, and then opening to a free and open conversation, right? And my idea is to start with a challenge, and then the first slide, that is to put the idea that today is a celebration of women and gender diverse people.
Okay, you don't mind.
Yes,
I mean, like, can you
Oh,
project now so that we can
sorry,
get started?
because I need to say that, because he told me that not to look backwards, so I'm trying to concentrate on you and at the same time at the slides.
Thank you.
So, as I said, today is the International Women's Day. It's a moment for reflection and action on women's rights.
Next, please.
And as a Brazilian, today is also a day for celebration. After 4 years of an aggressive, anti-gender and authoritarian government, the new government of President Lula has been rebuilding the human rights culture. The next slide. And you have the picture of the 5 new ministers that shows the intersectionality approach to human rights. And there was a feud heavily dismantled by former President Bolsonaro. At the international level, Brazil is again positioned as a rights-based voice for women and LGBTQI+ population. This shift is now seen at that Brazil withdraw from Geneva Consensus. If we can move to the next slide. And at this moment, at the participation at the CSW in New York, the United Nations Conference on Women. But at the local level, rebuilding the human rights culture will take time. One initiative focused on rebuilding this culture is the Commission of How to Avoid Hate in Social Spaces. It's the next slide. That was recently created by Minister Silva Almeida, who is the Minister of Human Rights. This Monday, this week, we had the opening session. I was one of the members appointed by Minister Silva Almeida. And he said, and I'm quoting him, the mission of this commission is educational and to work on rebuilding the human rights culture in this country to prevent hate, promote rights-based solutions, and protect those affected by harms. It is a quite different direction from his predecessor, and it's the next slide, former Minister Damares Alves, who once said, let me tell you 2 words, promotion and protection. Bolsonaro's government does not promote human rights. We protect the target communities and individuals. The differences between the 2 quotes are quite important. Both mention protection, but the content and the subject of protection are not the same. Minister Silva Almeida speaks about education for human rights, as well as prevention of harm, promotion of solutions, and protection for survivors. In a comprehensive understanding of human rights, protection is achieved by social policies, fulfillment of rights, and recognition of needs, which can also include criminal laws, but not primarily criminal laws. The victim is at the center of the response, and the structural changes are achieved by a permanent pedagogy in human rights at all levels of social life. For the former Minister Damares Alves, protection is achieved by criminal laws, criminal policies, targeting groups or persons who are perpetrators, with low attention or commitment to the victim's needs and rights. Protection is about exacerbation, the moral panic on issues with high likelihood to have a contagious effect, such as child abuse. But even in these tragic cases, human rights was not a source to protect the victims, but rather to impose a religious agenda against abortion. And the next slide, a paradigmatic case was that of the 10-year-old, just to double check if I'm right, a 10-year-old girl who was sexually abused at home during COVID-19 lockdown. and several barriers that were imposed to prevent her to access the safe and legal abortion. Minister Damares Alves was personally involved in the case and more concerned in wrongly enforcing the criminal law to prohibit the access to abortion than in taking care of the girl. The little girl ended up having the abortion in a public hospital. And after the fact, the government response was to increase the criminal investigation against women, girls, and every pregnant person seeking a legal abortion. Next. One of the first decisions of the new Minister of Health, Nisa Trindade, and I'm trying to do my best to show you the new faces of Brazilian government, so showing the diversity and how the new composition of the idea of intersectionality is now in the new government, was to revoke the executive order that imposed unjust barriers on victims of sexual violence. In relation to the anonymous girls, nobody knows what is happening, what happened with her. And basically, she's living in a shelter in a different community than the original one. So what I want to explore with you today is this false dilemma between promotion and protection, and how it's now circulating among women's groups with an unfortunate appeal to criminal law to regulate misogyny. A handful, it's the next one, a handful of Brazilian public feminist intellectuals started an online petition for 20,000 signatures to propose a legislative bill to criminalize misogyny. In less than 10 days, they reached their target, and the bill was proposed yesterday. The campaign, the next one, gained the headlines of important national outlets. An evident case of punitive populism, and it carries an intuitive demand for equality via criminal law. And I'm quoting them. If racism and homophobia are crimes, why not misogyny? Ending the quote. The question is compelling in its rhetoric, but it's false in an ethical stance. It departs from the assumption that the criminalization of all harmful conduct is a just measure for equality. There is also the related question of how we should use our feminist labor for advocacy. To increase positive rights, such as decriminalizing abortion, or changing social norms, such as introducing human rights, gender equality, or misogyny discussions in the school curriculums, and pressuring the private sector for equal job, equal pay, or working on criminal regulation of behaviors. Yes, you can properly say that the political space can embrace different strategies. And I will return to this point at the end of my presentation. And I need just to make a brief pause here. In 2019, during Bolsonaro's government, when the Supreme Court ruled the criminalization of homophobia and transphobia are similar to criminalization of racism, and it's the next one, I was one of those to celebrate the decision publicly. And even though I had not been involved in the litigation or in the campaign, for the reasons that I'm now sharing with you, that I don't think that the criminal law should be the center of our advocacy, but I've done it. And now this tweet, they are just replacing homophobia and putting misogyny, saying, how can you be such an incoherent person? And I can try to respond to you, how incoherence is part of doing advocacy. So even though I was not publicly involved, when the Supreme Court took the decision under Bolsonaro's government, I was there to celebrate. And because if the court had ruled differently, the facts might have been tragic. So the implications led me to celebrate the decision as an achievement. As you can see from this image, I'm now being blamed for not embracing the misogyny campaign and being publicly speaking what I'm sharing with you today and writing about how our feminist labor should not be concentrated on criminal law. I'm sure that the same script will happen again why I'm presently a critic of the campaign, I will ultimately celebrate the bill if it's approved. I share this case because it reflects the ambiguity of the feminist investment in punishment. The questions are in the form of a false dilemma. Responding no to the law is deemed to be siding of the misogynists. So going back, and it's the next one, it was shown by Sonia Correa and Vera Karam. The appeal to criminal law to advance sex and gender rights was not created by Bolsonarism and its authoritarian stance, but it was certainly enhanced in the past years. Several authors have discussed how feminist and LGBTQI+ groups and movements have been connecting their agendas to carceral politics of seeking recognition and protection in the criminal law for the unjust harms perpetrated by the oppressive powers. There is a sense that being named by the criminal law as a victim of homophobia, as a victim of racism, as a victim of disableism, and now as a victim of misogyny, is to be recognized as a citizen, or at least someone who deserves to be equally protected. As you can anticipate from my tone, I cannot follow that path. Criminal laws were not created to protect women or any other gendered or racialized or oppressed person or groups. The criminalization of the bodies is a tactic to control and restrict rights. Brazil has one of the most restrictive laws on abortion in the world. Abortion is criminalized in all circumstances, with 3 exceptions: to save pregnant person's life, and I'm expanding the understanding because the criminal law says just woman, in case of fetal anencephaly, and in case of rape. As shown in the case of the 10-year-old girl, the bearers are many, at the hospitals, police stations, and courts. Abortion is a common event for an ordinary woman in Brazil. Women know how to access the pill, know how to have an abortion, how to survive to clandestinity. The abortion question is about decriminalization, which means how to erase abortion from the criminal law and assume it as a public health need. There is at this moment, for example, a pending case at the Brazilian Supreme Court, which I'm 100% involved in it, and it's a different perspective of working on criminal law that is erasing the criminal law that demands the full decriminalization in the first 12 weeks. So there is no evidence, and around the globe, that criminal laws can be used to educate, and I'm again quoting the authors of the movement, to educate people about wrongdoing or to change behaviors, particularly on moral issues such as sexuality and gender. Comparative evidence, and there is abundant evidence about it, how criminalization of homophobia shows that most of the laws are useless with poor enforcement. The leaders of the misogyny campaign about the harms of misogyny, the leaders of the misogyny campaign support the idea that the law will serve not only to persecute the haters, but also to educate about the harms of misogyny. But I really ask you, and it's a genuine question, how can a criminal law be educational? The question sounds like a contradiction in its own terms, and ignores the harmful effect that any criminalization can have on already vulnerable bodies, such as those racialized in a racist society, in a highly punitive society as it is Brazil. Who will be dignified victim of misogyny and who will be the typical perpetrator? We all can guess the response. The white woman will be the victim and the Black man will be the perpetrator. I myself, a survivor of the hate machine, is the next one, as described by Patricia Campos Melo. And she describes the hate machine as the proliferation of misogynistic hate speech that dominated social spaces during Bolsonaro's government. I personally used the criminal law available to me to protect myself against the death threats. I use the vocabulary available to me: violence against women, harassment, death threats, even the vocabulary of terrorism against the university. Most of the cases have gone nowhere, but I had to go to the courts to protect myself, to protect my family, to create at least public documentation, public memory of the facts. So I'm not proposing an abolitionist agenda for human rights and to women's rights movements. My point is just about the use of our creative labor as a human rights thinkers and defenders. And I can open the discussion about the proportionality of this point. I'm not talking about not using criminal law to femicide or to violence against women. I'm talking about using criminal law to regulate social life and things like hate speech. Am I much more preoccupied with decriminalizing our bodies, in advancing a feminist pedagogy of human rights, in expanding our ecosystems of supporters? But that is the second reason, which I have no academic evidence to support, so please consider it with caution. A different feminist ethics, a different set of affections, of emotions, are mobilized when we promote positive rights instead of embracing the carceral state. There is no formula for how to promote this new pedagogy in social spaces. It's a slow and permanent process of changing values and emotions, moving from fear to risks. Understandably, I guess, the ask for a new pedagogy to occupy public spaces sounds insufficient and too slow for some groups, particularly for those most affected by the brutality of Bolsonaro's government. Bolsonarism has always been anti-gender. It's not by chance that the fallacy of gender ideology and the persecution against abortion rights were at the center of his moral discourse. And I'm ending. The sense of being wounded and the sense of urgency to change the state of things have been driving the belief that a reasonable path forward is to use criminal policies to create justice. As stated by a memo signed, and it's the final one, this is the national campaign of trans feminist rights. That is basically in Portuguese, we are not enemies. And when the Lula's cabinet was formed, they had a time of transition to his inauguration, and a group of organizations that are listed here, they sent a kind of assessment of what is needed to be done to women's rights and gender diverse people rights. And basically, I'm quoting them. Bolsonaro's government caused an extensive dismantling of women's rights and policies. It was not by chance. It was a political project to invisibilize and oppress women. I'm closing the quotes. So the challenge in front of us is to find the most strategic route to catalyze our indignation and the strength for advancing feminism in Brazil. It's about creating a new feminist political project. Thank you, and I hope it made sense, and I'm really open to hear about it.
Thanks so much, Débora. That's a great inspirational way to start a conversation. And before we enter the discussion, I just have to say something that all of you are going to be proud of. The fact that several of the names and the pictures that you saw in Débора's presentation are affiliated or connecting with Colombia. Patricia Campos Melo, who coined the term hate machine. She was a speaker in this seminar a couple of years ago. And Minister Silvio Almeida, he was a visiting professor here last year. So unfortunately, you missed the opportunity to interact with them. The good news is that there's a precedent of people coming to this class and becoming taking over senior government positions. So we might see Débora eventually as in a position of decision maker. But Débora, so thank you very much for setting the stage for discussing those very important topics, in particular in a very special day. One way for us to get the conversation started is to differentiate policy and politics. So could you comment on the evolution of gender policies and to what extent they have shaped the way that we deal with issues related to LGBTQI+.
So do you want me to differentiate? So everything in our life is about politics, right? So there is no other way. The movements and the way that the governments operate is about being political in its sense. But to design policies is a way of protecting needs, is a way of protecting rights, is a way of fulfilling rights. So the dispute about which policy will be the official public narrative about how to protecting specific groups' needs, it's something that is crucial to the participation of movements and accountability. So during Bolsonaro's government, if you remember the picture that I showed you with 5 different ministers from the indigenous nations to women's rights, to human rights, to Afro-descendant population, all of them were condensed in just one that was named as family, women, and human rights. And it tells a lot about the morality behind the political and the policy design of Bolsonaro's government. So it was morally driven, but morally driven being anti-gender and with a concept of family that it was hugely heterosexual and controlling the biological and social reproduction of life. So it was a huge dismantling of women and LGBTQI plus policies during Bolsonaro's government, and there is no money, no fund for the women's minister, and she will operate in the first year of Lula's government having no budget because it was decided during Bolsonaro's government. It's just to show you the level of dismantling that Bolsonaro left the government. And it was not just erasing the agenda, it was also replacing the agenda for something that will take years to all of us to rebuild, as Minister Silvio Almeida said, to understand human rights as part of the values and the culture of Brazilian society. So this game with words like protection and promoting is not just playing with words. It's the way that you put human rights at the center of the policy design.
Very good. No, absolutely. Thank you. And if anything else, the way that the team has been politicized in many ways also raised, helped create awareness about the topic. And one thing that I always mention in this class is that we didn't used to talk about gender policies, and this is the first time in this course, since I started teaching it for the past 10 years, that we talk about LGBTQI+. So it shows a reflection of the policy agenda. So what can we expect next? Since that this is a topic that it has been at the forefront of the headlines, and as a change administration, we expect this issue to be continued to receive as much attention as it has in the past.
Yes. So I will give a concrete example, right? This hate commission, it's strange to describe in this way, but the name is a commission to face hate, to combat hate. We need to find a good way of describing what we'll do, right? But it's a learning commission, and one of the groups, the working groups, will be exclusively dedicated to LGBTQI plus population, and a second one to women, a third one to religious intolerance, a fourth one to indigenous nations. So it's just to give you an example, right? And the second one is the way that this group of 5 ministers, they are really putting an intersectional agenda between them. So it's a kind of anecdote, but one of an important ministers at the first days of her tenure and with Lula, she said, I cannot find Afro-Brazilians, Black women, as we say in Portuguese, to hire to work with me because I don't know where they are. So the Minister of Racial Equality, she said, I'm here. I will pay you a visit to show you this bunch of CVs that you can select someone. So the way that they are interacting between them is a kind of intersectionality in front of you with a concrete agenda. So I would say that the experience from the past, that was a fragmented agenda. Here is women, here is health, here is social policy. It's now being challenged, including in the configuration of those occupying the power. And this is really something important about changing the representation of power. Those people are changing the way that they occupy the power. They are not occupying, trusting that we do have borders between expertise, that you are the one to speak about economics and I'm the one to speak about race equity. No. I will challenge your agenda that every single discussion about poverty is about talking about women as the breadwinners. So it's really challenging the way that we understand, including the borders between expertise in the first level of the power.
Yeah, and talking about policy agenda, right? If we're in a single leader's shoes, if you're part of this administration, and if you had the power to implement policies, what do you think would be the low-hanging fruits that, if implemented, would create the most impact, both on the gender issues, but also on the Black plus specific agenda?
I'm not Silvia Almeida, so I will give my response, right? With no responsibility about representing Brazilian government, and that is part of my life. I have no doubt that there is no gender equality. There is no discussion about equality or equity within a country that criminalizes abortion. So I'm putting at the center of the discussion that controlling social reproduction of life is controlling who with whom and when a woman will have a family, will use the care time. It's about poverty, it's about distribution of needs and time. So I have no doubt that will be my first agenda, and because of that I'm not in the government, because this is not a good response. But honestly, because a typical response would be, working on poverty, working on distributing income, and working on food security. Of course that we all know these basic needs, they are essential to have a good life. But when you are the one that is going, the most recent data that we have is that, and probably it's changing, but it's 1 in 5 at the age of 40 had at least one abortion in life. And most of them, something like half of them, I will be more precise in a couple of weeks about this data. So maybe it's 1 in 5, 1 in 7, but half of them had the first abortion while in their adolescence. So we're talking about a youth public health issue when we criminalize abortion. So we're talking about life projects. We're talking about staying in school, giving up school. And so that would be my response. And it's not a very easy response, right?
Absolutely. Fortunately, we're in academia where
we can do that.
Exactly. And if there's one place in the world where abortion plays a central role in politics, is this country. So for all of us, we're very familiar with the topic. And can you draw some parallels between the way that we talk about abortion here in the US compared to Brazil?
Yeah, I don't know about who of you that are Brazilians or Latin Americans, but for the first time after almost 5 years in this country, I started to receive a very strange question. That is, what can we learn from Latin America on abortion? It's the first time that the question was, flip. And I think that we are not in a position of teaching anyone. I mean, us, not Brazil, but the green wave in Latin America, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico. of changing anyone because there is no formula. And secondly, we do not want to repeat the colonial thing of here is the formula and here is the solution. But there are a lot of similarities, especially in the south of the United States, with the global south, not just Latin America. So if you go to countries like Nigeria, if you go to countries like Pakistan, if you go to countries like Turkey, India, you do have this combination of authoritarian governments and anti-gender agenda and regulating abortion, putting abortion as a moral panic, a moral battle is part of the tactic of playing with politics, patriarchal politics, right? So I think that the global south has a lot of learnings that we could put to understand better what is happening in Texas at this moment. That one of the views is to penal, lethal execution of women who has an abortion. So it's a kind of imagination to use criminal law to persecute women that the global south has for a long time, the same imagination. But I would say that the pieces of reality that could help us to understand what is happening here and there and here, it's also about this combination of authoritarianism and a anti-gender movement, and having some issues related to gender and sexuality. The trans issue is one that evolves the moral panic as part of the agenda.
And when we think about best practices, can you highlight some examples all over the world that you would like to see emulated in Brazil?
On abortion or on the gender?
And we can start with abortion and next Spanish.
So a country that was absolutely unexpected to all of us was Argentina. It was throughout the pandemic with a huge economic crisis. And all of us, we saw millions of women and girls and families on the streets. And the law was the first one to speak, women and every pregnant people. And it was not just about expanding the language about us, but it was also about connecting abortion to protection of motherhood. So it's about if you, with whom and when. It was really a comprehensive family planning, understanding, or reproductive and sexual reproductive justice, right? So Argentina is a very good example. And for Brazilians, it's difficult to look even southern to say, we have a good example here. We don't need to look, the South Star is there. The second one, of course, is Colombia recently, a decision from the Supreme Court that erased abortion from the criminal code. Just Canada and South Korea had this experience before, saying, why do we have abortion in the criminal law if it's a health need? So the case in the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Supreme Court, Colombia has two Supreme Courts, was to say, we need to raise it. It's the same in Mexico, but now you need to regulate in each different state. So we do have good examples and good examples of new interpretation of what is the demand. That is not about moralities and panic, but it's about a need.
By the way, it's good to know that we can learn something from Argentinians apart from abortion.
And football.
And soccer, exactly. And what about LGBTQI plus best practices?
You know, Brazil was a country until Bolsonaro that was a leading voice, especially on international affairs, and having a very progressive voice. And it's expected that at CSW, at this moment in New York, Brazil will gain back this respectability, internationally speaking. Brazil was one of the first countries in the 90s when that was really this moral panic with HIV offering universal health care to people living with HIV/AIDS. So we have a lot of experiences, and it's so interesting, Sydney, to follow how just one term of a horrible government can easily destroy with something that took maybe 2.5 decades to be built. But Brazil is one of the most dangerous countries to LGBTQI people, and especially to trans people. The life expectancy for trans people in Brazil is 35 years old. So it's a very dangerous country.
Right, and several of our students here, they are doing their Masters in International Affairs. So I think that we can talk a little about what's going on in the national sphere. When you think about countries with a progressive agenda and the foreign policy, can you think of some of the examples of state actors that have been pushing the legal framework in order to make it more favorable to both on the gender side, but also on the LGBT development plus issues?
It changes rapidly, international sphere, right? So at this moment, if you would have asked me that last July, I would have responded Sweden, but it's not. It's moving to the right. At this moment, it's Canada. It's and having a feminist foreign policy that Sweden used to have, but moved. We do have countries like, it's becoming even more difficult, but Mexico is an important voice. It's expected that Brazil will be back to this arena. And some of the, I need to double check. I work with a group of people that is now at the CSW working on language. I don't know if you know, CSW is the Commission of Women. And this year is on digital health and digital solutions, and CSE, comprehensive sexuality education. So it's really new configuration of countries we're expecting to be what we call the allies at this moment. So maybe I can respond to you better tomorrow, because we're now mapping the space.
Very good. And as you know, Hillary Clinton just became part of our faculty here. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that people might infer is the fact that having women in leadership positions that heads of state might lead to better policies, or at least a closer attention to the issue that we're discussing here. Do we have some anecdotal evidence, or is this something that is backed by hard data?
No, I think that we have a lot of evidence how women, when they occupy power, the power is recolonized from a different perspective. It's not anything based on our nature. It's much more the way that you occupy power, right? But it's not every woman, right, Sydney? We had good experiences of women during Bolsonaro's government that they played the machos game even worse than some men. So you need women in leadership positions with a rights-based frame, or if not a feminist stance to power. Otherwise, they can be just machines to reproduce inequalities. So maybe when Hillary Clinton said that for the first time, and in her generation, it was really something unbelievable to have women in position of powers as she had. But at this moment, we need more than that. We need diversity. We need women committed to gender justice. We need women with no fear of challenging the oppressive powers. And so it's a new profile of women that we need.
Fantastic. Thinking about the future, right? Let's say that we are having this class 5 years from now, and we look back. What do you think is going to be the roadmap that will lead to hopefully a better scenario that we find today?
There is no change that is made by any individual alone. You need the collectivity. You need the movements. And it's really difficult to people to understand, because the questions about the power of movement building are the wrong questions. You ask me, show me your advocacy wins. Show me what the policy change that you made. Nobody does any change alone. And we have the language of success that is selecting some of us as heroes or sheroes And it's wrong questions. We need to understand that when something like what is happening in Venezuela is happening now, and you have just one organization providing SRHRJ to the community, and this organization is in a permanent sense of resilience in the community, and they are there, and they are providing basic care, different from those international organizations that go and save people, save needs, and out of the country after the emergency. That movement building is about resistance, persistence, and being resilient, but at the local level. And it's very difficult to respond to the donors and funders about what success look like to exist. So 2 weeks ago, I was in Pakistan, and knowing how can you do comprehensive sexuality education in Pakistan. And basically what they say is that we do life basic skills, which is very smart. That is avoiding the forbidden language and understanding and the wrong questions that we immediately pose. What are happening with the girls? Are they leaving school because they want to get married? No, they're not in schools because there are no schools for them. So how to get connected with them if every single institution of the state, the tactic is to disappear with them. You're not in the streets, you're not at the labor force, they're not in the schools, they're just in the house, waiting to be exchanged with other families to get married. So how to reach them? How to talk to them about safety, to be protected by abuse, gender-based violence. So they work with life-based skills. They enter in schools when there are girls, they enter in the community, they work with lady health workers. So I'm telling that these two stories about Venezuela and Pakistan, two different realities with the different compositions of power, to say the commonalities is that when you have authoritarian government, the agenda of anti-gender, the controlling the bodies of women and girls and gender diverse people are there. But you need local organizations to be connected and to build trust with the communities. And they do make a huge difference. So my response to you is that maybe in 5 years, we need to understand better, and maybe because this country, we need to understand better to solve what is happening with abortion, is that you need strong social movements. You need strong communities on essential causes.
Excellent. Since we are in academic setting, right? Any particular questions and or topics of research that you've come across that you'd like our students to address?
It's a good question, right? I can also give you an example again. On reproductive health, that is one, I would just give an example, and you can use as a proxy to others. One is about this, how to raise the right questions to those groups and to these movements about what they do. When we ask those questions, what success look like, show me the numbers, show me the impact, show me the target population, wrong questions. When an organization is needed to exist, because if they survive, the community survives. Favelas da Maré is a complex of favelas, slums in Brazil. If you follow the capacity of the community to respond to COVID is impressive, because Brazilian census does not enter in the favelas. They have their own census reproducing the national census. So they know how many people they have, where they are, and what is needed to take care of what is needed by the community. So when COVID hit, they had a huge apparatus of community support that was moved to respond to COVID. What we call Casa das Mulheres, Women's House, become the place to cook to those affected by COVID. The local health promoters become people to distribute vaccine or to identify people affected. The numbers of affected people at Maré was one of the lowest in country. So this capacity of community response, we don't know by science how to explain. How is it built? And WHO is now speaking about community-driven, community-based solution to emergencies. What does it mean? What does it mean to build a trust? What does it mean to cultivate a community, to trust in their leaders to respond in a case of emergency? We don't know that. But it can give you a second example that is related to that. One is about asking about success metrics and how to tell the story that the fund or the investment makes sense. But the second one is we have been talking a lot about this expression that is harm reduction. You know that maybe from intuitive, if you are not from public health, that is for drug users, that you start healing those people with harm reduction tactics, that is reducing the number of daily use of whatever the person uses. On abortion, we started doing harm reduction. That is basically, if the law criminalizes abortion, in most of the cases, the law doesn't criminalize access to information. So this model of harm reduction on abortion was created by an organization in Uruguay, and now is in transnational experience with Uganda, Tanzania, and a recent paper published in a very important academic journal did a systematic review of the evidence of harm reduction and said, look, from those bunch of studies, there is almost no evidence that harm reduction functions. And I tried. So the 4 studies that were selected as the final ones with poor evidence, all of them were funded by the organization that I work with. So I do have a very deep interest in understanding the poor evidence. And when you read the methodology, all the studies, the data was collected in clinic settings. Most of the harm reduction initiatives are done in the community level. So the point is that we are reproducing something that there is a bias at the beginning, because it's where we can collect data. So you're saying this policy is not working, but the data that you do have access to test the quality of the policy is not the best data. So my point is that how can we develop better methodologies to respond to the question that is needed for the communities, not just for our academic circulation of ideas?
Thanks so much. So we are now finalizing the first part of our session here, and Camila, we can stop the